All right. I'm going to talk real fast. I'm out of the beginning and start to me, and I'm going to say everything. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. She said you have 1 minute, and I got 1 minute. I got a 5-minute speech here. I do want to remind some housekeeping. So in the book here, we have some QR codes. It says visit our website, view the speaker bios. It's on page 18. And then the final one, which I don't know if anybody's mentioned this, it's provide us feedback on the conference, on everything that you did. If you went to Mexico on a bus that took 9.5 hours to come back, you can comment on that. I think we almost left somebody behind too in Mexico. But if you can do that, we would really appreciate it so we can improve anything we need to. We can keep what we need to when we go to Chicago in 2 years, and we will take that information very seriously. So I just want to make sure that you all can go on that. I think it's 35 or 40 questions only. Kidding, it's about 10. Takes about 10 minutes, maybe less than 10 minutes to fill out. All right, well, I'll start because we are on a time limit. I have to say I'm very honored to provide the introduction for this extraordinary person. I first met Sarah, and I actually volunteered to do this intro because I remember meeting Sarah at a National Trust conference, and I was trying to remember which one. Maybe she knows. And we briefly talked about her becoming an advisor to the trust. She had all these questions because I was already an advisor to the trust. And at that time, I said, have you heard about Latinos in heritage conservation? She's like, no. So I think I introduced her to her, but she can deny it. And since then, Sarah has been part of the, what I mentioned earlier, she's been part of our LHC familia since, even though she has accelerated to another position. Sarah C. Bronin was confirmed by unanimous consent by the United States Senate in December of 2022 to serve as the 12th chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. A Mexican-American, she is the first person of color to serve in this position. And I had to look. I had to research about when did this start, and it's almost 60 years it's 58 years in the process, 1966, and she's the first person of color. We've been talking all day about this. Here we are. That's proof. But she's there, right? So let's all applaud again that she's already there. Prior to her confirmation, Chair Bronin spent her career as a professor and public servant. Her interdisciplinary research in areas of property, land use, historic preservation, and energy was focused on how law and policy can foster more equitable, sustainable, well-designed, and connected places. She has published 5 books and dozens of articles on these topics. She also founded the National Zoning Atlas, which aims to translate and standardize information about how zoning regulates housing in around about 30,000 jurisdictions nationally. While chairing the ACHP, she is on leave as a tenured position in Cornell University, where she serves as a professor in the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, professor in the Rubacha, I hope I'm saying that, Department of Real Estate, an associate faculty member of the law school, and a member of the graduate faculty in the field of architecture. Among her nonprofit service, she has served she did become an advisor to National Trust, by the way, and the Sustainable Development Code, and she served on the board of our organization, Latinos Heritage and Conservation. In addition, she chaired Preservation Connecticut and led the nationally recognized efforts of the City of Hartford to draft and adopt a climate action plan, a city plan, and a zoning code overall. In addition, Chair Bronin has consulted for public and private entities, including on zoning reform, project construction, and litigation strategy. Chair Bronin received a JD from Yale Law School, where she used her Harry S. Truman Scholarship for Public Service. She received an Master of Science in Economic and Social History from the University of Oxford, where she was Rhodes. I don't know, how can I keep going on this? My God, stop it, Sarah. You did it. You could have just said you worked at a Friar Burger King, and I would have been done. Anyway, I picked Burger King because that's the list of the McDonald's, right? Maybe, I don't know. She received her Bachelor's of Architecture and BA in the Plan 2 Liberal Arts Honors Program at the University of Texas in Austin. Go Longhorns! Last paragraph, everybody. Settle down. Chair Bronin is a seventh-generation Texas-born and raised in and around Houston. She is the daughter of a public school teacher, all right, a civil engineer, all right, and she grew up working in her grandparents' Mexican restaurant. And I do want to ask her, did you cook the food, or what did you do there? Do you have the recipes? I'll talk about it. Good. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our own Honorable Sarah C. Bronin.
Good afternoon, everybody. So it is really an honor to be here, and I know a lot of people say that when they start their speeches, but this is really, really an honor to be here before you. I don't know of any other place where Latinos can gather like this, and I don't know of any other organization. There's not another organization like LHC. And so I do want to start my speech today with gratitude. First, I want to express gratitude to every single person that has served on the LHC board, particularly the founding members of this board, because you made today possible. And I was, Eddie, very honored to be one of your colleagues on the board, even if for a brief while. I want to thank all the award winners last night for their contributions to Latino culture, and I also want to thank someone who honors us by allowing us to honor others, Antonia. Thank you, and all of those here today that contribute to telling our stories. I want to thank the 5 fellows who are here, and especially Michael Lopez, my former ACHP intern, but also the rest of you, because what you've done by showing up here today is you've said, I'm raising my hand to carry the mantle forward, the next generation of Latino heritage leaders, and what you've done by showing up here, by being part of this, is so important. So thank you for being here. And then finally, I want to thank Selah Mota and Casper and her exceptional team who have organized this event and who have really inspired me with their leadership and really thrilled me. And it really does give me chills to see how LHC has grown and how you're going to just take the world over. So thank you for everything that you do. And for, again, including me today. So just quickly on my background, since Eddie asked. So yes, I am Mexican-American. Those are the first words in every bio that I have, hopefully, out there in the world today, unless somebody edits them out. It's really something that's central to my identity. I am a 7th-generation Texan, like an earlier speaker said. The border crossed my family. In the Latino Book Review a couple years ago, I wrote an article about some family history I had unearthed about how the federal government, the government of which I'm now a part, actually stole my family's land and never paid them. The Salinas family, of which I am one of probably hundreds, maybe thousands of descendants of Miguel Salinas. But that land loss at the hands of the federal government and at Fort Brown, which became the place where the United States launched its offensive on Mexico and through manifest destiny conquered the Mexicans. Again, that was my family's land. It turns out my great-grandmother's stories were true, and I didn't really believe them until I started researching the issues. But anyway, my whole family is from Brownsville. As Eddie said, I grew up in Houston. And I did grow up working in my grandmother's Mexican restaurant. And I wasn't in the kitchen. I was in the front. So I bussed tables, I waited tables, I was at the cash register, and I helped them manage a little side store where they sold, Mexican dresses and things like that we brought up from Brownsville. But my sister was in the kitchen, and one of the best stories that we have in the family, she's about 7. So I'm talking about working these restaurants I was there when I was born, and I was there until high school. So there was basically no moment of my life where I had free time, where I wasn't at the restaurants, whatever they were, one at a time, often, not doing so well, then converting to something else, going to a different spot, and then starting over with my grandparents. But my sister came out from the kitchen, because that's where she was, and it was a full restaurant. She came out in her apron. She must have been about 7. She sat down at one of the tables, and my dad looked at her like, "What are you doing?" Because he was a waiter at the restaurant after his engineering job. And she said, "Well, you'd be tired, too, if you were back there washing dishes all day." So everybody in the whole restaurant heard this little kid, and it's like, well, that's the family business. But I will say that she also is in historic preservation, too. She is a historic preservation tax credit asset manager at NTCIC, for those of you who know that organization. It's a for-profit subsidiary of the National Trust. So I don't know if the restaurant business led us into historic preservation, but we both ended up there. And so there you go. The restaurants were really led by my grandmother, and it really struck me yesterday when we presented the award to the food expert, and thinking about foodways and culture and how important that was for me. I will say, write something for the Abuelas Project. This is her necklace, my grandmother's necklace. She passed away about a year ago, which is a huge sort of thing. I think with Latinos, we often have multi-generations influencing us and sticking with us. And for me, both grandmothers well into my 40s. So it was wonderful to have her in my life, and she was a huge influence. But you didn't really come here, I don't think, to hear me reminisce about my grandmother. We did? Maybe I'll bring her back in somehow. You came to hear me talk about, and by the way, it says I have an H in my name, but I'm Mexican. There's no H in my name, so just kind of cross that out in your program. But I know you brought me here to talk about the ACHP and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. So let me just ask, how many people have heard of the ACHP? Okay, and so for those of you who haven't raised your hands, it is the independent federal agency based in Washington, D.C., that is tasked with a couple of jobs by the National Historic Preservation Act. It was set up back in 1966 when the Historic Preservation Act was first passed, and it has 24 members by statute. 10 of those members are other federal agencies, so like Interior, Agriculture, Defense, HUD. 8 of them are individuals appointed by the president. I am the only full-time appointee on the 24-member body, and I was appointed by the president, as you heard. There is a governor, a mayor, a tribal member, and then there are 3 organizations with which you might be familiar. One is the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which Eddie and I both have been advisors for, the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, and the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. So this really is a body that represents many different aspects of preservation practice. And so with that background as to who the ACHP is, I want to talk about what it does. I like to say it has 2 big jobs. The first one is the policy job. So this makes it different from the Park Service. It makes it different from other agencies that might work on history and preservation. We are tasked with being the agency that helps to influence and establish federal historic preservation policy. The second thing that we do is we administer the Section 106 review process. So who knows what that is? Okay, lots of you do, maybe everybody. But for those who don't, it is a process affecting 120,000 federal agency actions every year. It is the single largest environmental review process that the federal government administers, I think. It has encompasses about 10 times the number of actions that NEPA encompasses, because NEPA is only major federal actions, and the Section 106 process is any old thing a federal agency does. So it is pretty influential. So I want to talk first about policy, then I want to talk about 106. So from a policy perspective, ACHP has this big responsibility to help forge ahead in preservation policy. And when I became chair in January 2023, I literally read every single word that our laws, our regulations, our policies. And what I quickly realized on the policy side was that our agency had not updated its policies regularly and had not really taken a forward-looking approach to two areas about which I'm very passionate, and I know many in this room are too. I love that we have the Green Latinos here and other environmental groups. And those are climate change and housing. So typically our agency has adopted, that means the 24 members have voted formally on a policy once every 3 years. Since I've been chair, we've adopted 4 policy statements. The first thing I did was to open a discussion on climate change and historic preservation. Again, you all in this room know how impactful climate change is on our historic properties for the bad. We also know that historic properties, especially historic buildings, can be a climate change solution for the good. Understanding the intersections between climate change adaptation, mitigation, the opportunities we have, was something that we hadn't really sort of tackled as an agency and that needed to be articulated in one of our policy statements. So in July of last year, June or July, we had gone through a collaborative process. We talked about all of these issues. We wrote a policy statement about them when we adopted that in July. The second thing, housing. We actually had a policy on the books from 2007. It was limited to just talking about affordable housing, and it was limited to just talking about Section 106. But as you know, there's so many different aspects of housing that go beyond our narrow regulatory process that preservationists do need to be engaged in at the local level, the state level, interactions with tribes and tribal housing, and them as sovereign governments, and recognizing that, that I said that we were reopening that policy statement, expanding it beyond just affordable housing to cover all aspects of housing, and expanding our advice that we're supposed to give as part of the advising function to the president, Congress, and state and local governments to include lots of areas outside of 106, meaning tax credits, meaning zoning, meaning planning, meaning climate change intersections, and recognizing in that statement, as we had in the climate statement, that the impact of a housing shortage, just like the impact of climate change impacts, falls disproportionately on our communities and other communities of color, low-income people, and indigenous peoples. So we passed that updated housing policy statement in 2023 in December. So those two statements have been used by local governments, they've been used by state governments and other federal agencies to help influence their work. In fact, just today, I found that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council in Boston had cited our policy statement in some public conversations that they've been having about historic preservation and housing. So I hope that the ACHP can be looked at as a leader in assembling research-based best practices that about different topic areas, including the couple that we've covered in the topics that I just mentioned, so really truly being that advisor. So the ACHP members, we voted on each statement. I think there was only one abstention between the two of them. That was the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. But I look at both of those statements as huge successes, and I hope you check them out online. I will also say that I was fortunate to have already had the Office of Tribal and Indigenous Peoples embark on policy statements on two other very important topics, one affecting the Latino community for sure, which is a topic of burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects, and I bet every person in this room knows or has familiarity with a Latino resting place that has not received the attention that it deserves and may in fact have been harmed by federal government, state and local processes. So that does reflect that injustice, and it seeks to remedy it. the last statement, again, I'll just briefly touch on this, is a statement on indigenous knowledge and historic preservation, which speaks to, and I know there are many intersections in this room for that, on that too, between Latinos and indigenous peoples, but that speaks to the need for the federal government to recognize indigenous ways of knowing, and it calls for us to incorporate indigenous knowledge into our Section 106 process. Just like the climate change and housing and burial site statements all said, these principles have to be incorporated into Section 106. So I would say the first year I was chair, I focused on getting the council to agree to these broad policy principles and sort of say how our agency was going to move forward in each of those areas. This year, second year, I guess I would say, I'm really focused on implementation. And the most important way we can implement the policy principles and those policy statements is through changes to the Section 106 process. So yesterday, and you'll be the first group that I speak to about this, and I did kind of want to hurry that along so that we could, I could talk about it today. But yesterday, our agency released what we call a program comment, which is our agency identifying actions in the Section 106 process that federal agencies can sort of see if their action qualifies and use an alternative means of complying with Section 106 that's outlined in the program comment. All of that is to say, some people might call it streamlining, some people might call it fast tracking, but essentially a program comment helps us identify those types of things that federal agencies do that deserve a different kind of treatment. Things that I had heard before, and I'll talk about the contents of that program comment in a minute, but it's called the program comment on accessible, climate resilient, and connected communities. And it covers 3 different topics. The first is housing. The second is climate smart buildings. And the third is climate friendly transportation. The reason we covered those 3 topics in this program comment and we kind of smashed them all together is because each of them are interrelated and each of them need to be addressed through historic preservation review processes with the thumb on the scale of housing creation and rehabilitation, of climate response through our buildings, energy efficiency and clean energy integration, and through improvements in the way that we think about the non-vehicular, non-greenhouse gas emitting types of transportation or less greenhouse gas emitting. So thinking about biking, pedestrian transit, buses, the things that, again, people who don't have access to cars use to get around. So what connects all of those, I think, is not just the social imperative for us to address those as preservationists, but also the individual examples that I as chair and maybe you out in the field have heard when it comes to Section 106 reviews. Just as one example, this to me just stuck out in my mind. It came in through a recent comment period. We had an affordable housing operator tell us that they had to wait 30 days as a result of local or state interpretations of 106 before they could install a grab bar in an elderly resident's bathroom. Now, what Section 106 issue is implicated by a grab bar in the bathroom? We've also heard from things like innocuous things, perhaps, like signage for public transit or improvements to bike lanes that really arguably cannot have an impact on historic places, but yet, you know, sometimes there's a feeling that, well, there's a visual adverse effect for things that people need to get around and people need to do. So these little decisions, these small interventions that receive federal funding should not require the same kinds of review processes that we see elsewhere. And that extra process, again, tends to hurt our community a little bit more than others. So just kind of now I want to talk a little bit about the contents, and then I want to talk about what I would love for you to do with this information. So the program comment as it applies to housing, and actually I want to recall some of the presenters that just presented. And I think a theme, especially in the last mention of the National Register, and Ray Rass' work on integrity and material integrity, is that preservationists have long been very formalistic about their adherence to material integrity. They're thinking that Well, it cannot change. And we know as Latinos, I mean, we can walk around in any Latino neighborhood in the country, and you see all kinds of things going on, right? Things that don't, that sometimes disqualify our sites for historic preservation status, whether it's at the National Register, the local, or the state level, because of this adherence to integrity. And you see that concept of integrity being embedded in decisions that are made pursuant to our federal preservation review process. So I think overarching some of the things that are contained in this program comment is an attempt to detach our federal decision-making from this pristine view of integrity, this idea that the buildings cannot change. And I'll quote Dr. Leva, who was on Zoom, who said, historic preservation is not about preserving buildings, or not just about preserving buildings, she said. It's about preserving communities. So this program comment is really about the things that people need: housing, transportation, and cleaner air, and better buildings. And so just to run down the list of each of these topics, so housing, the program comment would apply to any housing that is built by the federal government or any housing that's funded by the federal government. Every other program comment we've had has applied to just one program with one agency or just one subset of agency holdings. The reason this one is different is it would apply to any federal housing project, funded or built. So it would exempt most interior renovations, especially those to individual housing units, from our review process. It talks about site work and facade improvements. It talks about abatement of hazardous materials. HUD is one of our members. We heard from them that their public housing authorities were delaying radon, asbestos, and lead remediation projects because they were worried about our process. It cannot, our process cannot conflict with human health and safety. So if, for me hearing that, it says, well, we need to be clearer about where the thumb on the scales goes when it comes to these kinds of issues. If this housing program comment, that part passes, it would benefit about 1 million households living in 190,000 public housing buildings that are in the HUD portfolio. It would affect millions of units, including 846,000 units in military barracks that the Department of Defense operates, funded projects by the Department of Agriculture, veterans housing, and housing for lots of other federal agencies. So that's the housing piece. The climate smart buildings piece it really talks about buildings beyond housing and says that where federal agencies are doing something to reduce greenhouse gases, to reduce energy use, or to make a building more climate resilient, they get a green light for a large number of the things that they might do. Now, we don't want them to go do a whole bunch of ground disturbing stuff because that's will hurt or potentially harm archaeological resources. But things like facilitating electrification, replacing appliances, including, this is maybe a controversial one, allowing the installation of solar panels on buildings, even when they're on the primary facade, as long as they are removable without damaging historic materials. Broadening the scope of building envelope energy efficiency improvements, including insulation, doors, windows, without more preservation review. You all know we have a huge investment in this administration, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the infrastructure laws, the bipartisan infrastructure law. These are the biggest climate bills in history. There's a huge amount of money that's going out. Each and every dollar would trigger the 106 review process. So this is trying to catch up to that funding and make sure that that money can get out the door and we can get clean buildings too. And then finally, just on transportation, this is really important, I hope, and I think. In that particular section, we talk about specific things on bike, pedestrian, micro-mobility infrastructure. We talk about bike lanes, bike racks, striping, flex posts. So we bring out all the bike terms, they're in there. Talking about raised crosswalks, raised intersections, the thing that makes our streets safer, safe routes to schools decisions. Those things could trigger 106 review. What we're saying in that program comment is they shouldn't. When we are improving our streets for people, when we are making them more accessible, we're actually improving our historic communities, especially our historic main streets. These are investments that are compatible with our historic buildings. They should not have the same kind of review. And by the way, in fact, most highway infrastructure is exempted from reviews. I don't have to tell this room how devastating highway infrastructure has been to our community across cities in the country. So what I want to do with this program comment is to make it a little bit easier to build other kinds of transportation infrastructure that truly serve a wider variety of people. So again, this program comment doesn't look like any other, if you've ever participated in our process, it doesn't look like any other program comment you've seen. It tries to affect housing, buildings, and transportation projects across federal agencies, across a federal portfolio, and it does so with the eye to, again, distancing ourselves a small bit from the formalities of preservation that have really constrained, I think, our practice and made us very sort of narrow-minded in terms of what we think preservation is, and has, I hope, it will open up a conversation among preservationists, because it is out for public comment, about what we actually value. So you would vote no on this program comment if you thought that the only thing that matters is strict material integrity. You might vote yes on this program comment with tweaks if you think that there is a broader view for what preservation is and should be. You know, just another quote I wanted to lift up before I close is a quote from Victor Reta, who said, "If you're not at the table, pull up a chair." So I am telling you, I am begging you, I am asking you, as the chair of the Federal Historic Preservation Agency, an agency that has a huge impact on the delivery of federal dollars to our community, an agency that flies under the radar far too often, but an agency that has the potential to really make things better for communities, for each of you to get involved in what we do. I would love for you to follow us and to keep track of the program comment that's going through the process. If you agree that we need to loosen that, if you agree that housing is the biggest priority, that climate change response is the biggest priority, please weigh in. If you have edits, weigh in on that, because we love getting line edits, specific comments. I need for you to really, really consider pulling up that chair. I also encourage you to become ambassadors for why preservationists need to be part of the solution in these conversations, because we get a bad rap sometimes, and we don't deserve it in many cases, because we've been at the forefront of creating and rehabilitating housing that's affordable. We have been at the forefront simply by reusing our buildings of a climate change response. But similar to what was said before, we don't even know that what we were doing was preservation. Sometimes we don't talk about ourselves enough to say what we are doing is creating housing. What we are doing is responding to environmental issues. So continuing to be there in your communities and talk about preservation being part of the solution is great. And then finally, I need for you to keep an eye on what this agency does. I'm going to be here for a short amount of time. Who knows how long? Depends on the election. It depends on a few things, but I am not going to be there forever. I'm the shortest term. I'm a temp in that agency. So I encourage everybody in this room to keep an eye on what the Federal Preservation Agency does, both while I'm there, hold us accountable, and while we're gone, when I'm gone, because I'm working as fast as I can to get a whole bunch of things done, but you've really got to be the ones that bring it home. So I'm going to stop right there, because I know we wanted to leave a couple minutes for questions, but I really, really, really am grateful to be in this room. So I just thank all of you for being here too.
Great information. Thank you, Sarah. You've asked us to really pay attention and get involved. I would hope that either on our screen this evening, tomorrow, all day, we have the contact information as to how to get involved. I mean, we can all look up websites, so I mean, we can all do that. But I think it's easier when we know what we're looking for. So that's going to be important for us to really follow through on your request.
Great. So 2 things on that. First, my email address is chair@achp.gov, and I respond to every email. But second, I'll send Selah all the information about the program comment. I didn't want to. We just released it yesterday, and I'm like, I'm not going to send it to her today. But if you would be willing to include it in an upcoming mailer,
Yeah,
that'd
we'd be
great.
happy to, and even include it in our newsletter.
Great. But again, if you ever want to find me, I'm at chair@achp.gov. I'm on social media. The USA ACHP is the handle across the agency's profiles, so please do connect.
Anybody else have any questions? Oh.
Hi, is the advisory council having any discussions or thinking about publicly acknowledging the connections between historic preservation and gentrification, specifically as we invest in these neighborhoods, protecting those that are still there as property taxes rise for those remaining in the neighborhood?
Thank you. And that is something that we do talk about in the Housing and Historic Preservation Policy Statement, both to recognize that the priority for local communities, especially in things like zoning and preservation reviews, needs to be to enable, and we call it in the policy statement, density without displacement. But we also call for additional research. So as a scholar, putting on my scholarly hat, the research generally tends to show that when you increase housing supply in a neighborhood, it actually helps to stabilize prices. But increasing housing supply in a historic neighborhood is often difficult because of historic preservation constraints or perceived constraints on density, of course, combined with zoning as well. We have also seen research from the LA Conservancy and others that show that historic districts are actually denser than, in that case, virtually any district in the city. You might say, well, that's just LA, LA is sprawling, but that is not, that actually can hold true in historic communities across the country. So on the one hand, there's a narrative that historic preservation stops housing. On the other hand, we have this sort of counter narrative or counterfactual that talks about how historic districts are more dense. So as a researcher, I think we really do need to get to the bottom of that. And one of the things I'm trying to do, separate from what I've talked about today, is position ACHP as the place that where historic preservation related research is able to be funded and grow. So part of what I've seen my job to be, and I'm only the second full-time chair of this agency, it bears noting. The first one was chaired during COVID, and I think that maybe hampered our efforts. So the Congress just transformed my position to be a full-time chair, and what I'm finding is that people in Congress have not heard of the agency. People don't realize how how big our review process is. I'm trying to say, hey guys, we're here. Come, engage with us, because we are such a tiny agency. And if we had more resources, we could do more. And I think one of those areas where we need to do more is research. Related to that point, we have been working with the Permitting Council, of which ACHP is one of 16 agency members. So we're up there, our tiny agency is up there with the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security and these other agencies that end up having a lot of projects going through review processes. And through the Permitting Council, we have received funding to start integrating data in a geospatial integrated map that will help inform Section 106 permitting reviews that are conducted by federal agencies. I do the National Zoning Atlas. I'm big into geospatial data. I'm big into mapping, because if you can't protect what you don't know where it is. The exception to that is tribal sites and confidential sites, which we exempt. We don't log. There's a whole protocol for dealing with that. But a lot of sites, you should know where they can be mapped, and we should know where they are. So that's my research pitch.
Great, thank you. Okay, and this is your last question.
Hi, I'm Eric Newcomb. I'm a National Register historian at History Colorado. You're not one of the first people to talk about changing perceptions for material integrity for historic sites. Is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation in conversation with the Keeper of the National Register about changing perceptions for material integrity? As somebody who consistently works with evaluating historic sites for their eligibility, we still use the 7 aspects of integrity as delineated in the National Register bulletins. And so I'm curious if you have had conversations with the Keeper about potentially formally issuing some guidance or recognition that those perceptions can or should be changing.
So, integrity is sometimes a moving target, right? So there's integrity of setting, integrity of location, integrity of design. And a lot of that can be very subjective just by its nature. One thing that I'm trying to do, so, Department of Interior is a member of the ACHP, so I'll just say that. So we are often in constant dialogue with them. We haven't really, as an agency, evaluated the National Register. So we're supposed to evaluate other agencies' programs and policies and things like that. We barely do that. We did do that with the Secretary of the Interior standards. I issued a report on that in March. Didn't get a chance to talk about that today. We haven't done that for the National Register. I will say that one thing that can inform our approach in this country to historic preservation in general is to look to what other countries have done. So in thinking about designations, UK, England is one example of a graduated register, graduated system of designation that subjects some resources to extremely high standards and other resources maybe to lesser standards, not because they're less important, but because the nature of those resources is more changing perhaps than Buckingham Palace, let's just say. So I've been trying to work for the first time, I think, for the agency with the State Department and their Cultural Heritage Office, and I'm convening with a professor at Georgetown, my co-author on one of our historic preservation law books, Peter Byrne, to convene in October a conference specifically on international approaches to climate heritage, so climate change and heritage, that should be streaming online, so October 4th for anybody who's interested. But what I want to do with that is learn what other countries are doing, both on the types of resources they protect, but of course also the strategies that they use to protect those resources from climate change. And third topic, the way that they incorporate indigenous knowledge into their heritage processes and into their climate response when it comes to buildings. So, I'll just say I think it's an ongoing conversation. Again, kudos to Ray and others who have raised this issue and assembled those statistics to the extent they can from the existing data that's out there for our program. But I really do think that increasing the amount of exchange that we have about international approaches can really help us move that forward. And if I do have a chance to continue on in this role past January 18th or whatever the day is, that is something that's going to be a priority for me because, of course, designation is the root of all preservation. If it is not designated, it does not get protected by federal, state, or local laws. If it is not designated, then it may not be seen as worthy by third parties or governments. So the designation process is key, and we'll never get it right. There are pros and cons of every approach, but I do think there's opportunity to improve what we have now, and that is something that I will hope to tackle if we have 4 more years. Just kidding. I will end there. But I really, really, really do, again, appreciate this opportunity, but encourage you to be in touch because I'll just say one last thing, which is when I was appointed, when I was finally confirmed, and by the way, LHC was my first organizational supporter. They were the first ones to write a letter saying that this person would not be that bad. She won't destroy America. But when I first got confirmed, every other individual appointee was a white male. We have a tribal member, and our tribal member. But I was the only woman, I was the only person of color, and of course the first person of color is chair. You all need to, be right there with me, and to the extent that I can help you understand how to engage, going back to Josie's question, can help you, navigate, okay, which one of these things is really important? We're doing a bunch of things at the agency. I would argue that this program comment is the most important thing for you to weigh in on that at least I've done that since I've been chair, and I would encourage that. But there are a lot of other things that if you have specific interests, we need your comments. We welcome your comments. You have the expertise. You have the examples. You have the ability to write the letters and the stories in a way that would convince my fellow members of the council to move forward on some of these initiatives. So I just encourage you to be in touch with me. This is my job. This is one thing I want to do is to make sure that everybody's involved. So I appreciate it if you reach out. I will return every email. Thank you.